All right, dudes and dudettes, it's time for this week's blog and thinking about the week and the reflections therein. There's some heavy stuff this week. Before I get to that, I'd like to offer a few reflections on the Protestant Reformation celebrating its 500th year and a recently released translation of the New Testament. In particular, Luther and Calvin and the core of the Reformation were offered a critique against the powerful tradition of the Catholic Church and the cultural norms that established authority and how you interpreted and engaged the foundations of that authority. So concepts, Latin concepts like claritas scripturae, or the clarity of Scripture, or the perspicuity of Scripture, was less about that the Scripture was easily interpreted, that it was just obvious, and more about the fact that it was efficient as a source to engage the character of God through Christ in Scripture, and therefore the foundations for moral structures or an engagement in a conversation about the authorities and how they were using justice. Right? And in particular, the Church's authority to determine the outcome of conflicts about Scripture or about moral right or wrongs. Now, this predates, obviously, Kant and the critique of pure reason, okay, and the Enlightenment. Luther's movement here is really necessary for the development of Descartes and Kant and this challenge to these traditional bases, these foundational elements, as Descartes would later on develop in his foundationalism, in his construct, that we tear the building down, examine the indubitable base, and then rebuild on top of it. Right? But Luther's critique and Calvin's critique is an idea as a public criteria for dialogue and interpretation, a critique of both tradition and the individual, as opposed to the critique of pure reason or Descartes' assessment, relocating things into the abstracted intellect. They are offering a critique within faith, about the traditioned elements and foundations of those faiths, and any individual that's using authority of the tradition or of themselves to establish new paradigms or paradigms that might be outside the norms. Now, if it's outside the norms, it doesn't mean it's wrong, of course, right? Because Luther wants to establish the ability to critique the norm. Right? And this is really important. Right? This is what establishes Protestant capabilities to engage in authority that's above normal established earthly paradigms. Of course, they're seeing Scripture here then is not something that then is under the church and under the government, right? But as Scripture is something that is equal to and perhaps even above those things. Right? This gives a foundation or a core. I would prefer this idea of a core around which all other pieces spiral out or interconnect in a web. Right? Several of cores that allow critique. So claritas scripturae is not just the plain meaning of Scripture, being that any idiot can pick it up and the Bible should be translated at 8th grade level and therefore anybody is held accountable. Rather, it is efficient, right, in its offering of something about the character of God through Christ. And therefore, it's able to critique authority, be it religious or political or economic. Now, of course, after the Enlightenment within the West, this changes its paradigm. This gets restructured, okay? And then the church begins to lose sight of certain things, and Protestantism goes on to have new reformations and arguments with itself, resulting in modern-day fundamentalisms and evangelicalism, which themselves are powerful movements trying to uphold again the authority of this Scripture box. Okay? But in the process, they've recently seemingly have lost the ability to even critique the foundations of their own tradition, even from within their tradition. To question the tradition is to commit an unpardonable sin, or to have somebody even outside of it to challenge the foundations, as it were, is unpardonable and something that's worth fighting against tooth and nail, and even in terrible rhetoric, perhaps blood. This, though, is against the spirit of the Reformation, which was about being able to appropriately critique the authority. To look authority in the eye and say, No, and no thank you. So cheers to you, Luther, for as much as I disagree with some of your things, and cheers to you, Calvin, for as much as and more for which I disagree with. But that spirit, an appeal to a higher authority, to be able to critique the norms both of tradition and of the individual, is valid even today. This leads to the translation of the New Testament that has just come out, been released and done by David Bentley Hart. And I'm going to read a couple. It's called The Translation of the New Testament. And I'll read a little bit from his introduction about what makes this translation both significant and a fun correlation to the Protestant Reformation. And I quote from him here: "Part of the task of illuminating the original text for Anglophone readers raised on the standard translations is, as I say, to give them a sense of the strangeness of the text, the novelty, the impenetrability, the frequently unfinished quality of the prose of the theology." He's talking about the New Testament and about how capturing some of the rawness of it, right? That obviously, always with the English translation, we don't get some of that in the Greek. Let me continue. "To this end, I have, on many occasions, chosen to offer the more unfamiliar or more baffling interpretation of a difficult passage, in part to apprise readers of the original, that the original may differ considerably from what they expect, but also because, in most cases, I truly believe that the more unsettling rendering is also the more accurate." That's great. To rattle the cage of what is so familiar it's become numb, of so tradition bound it only ever is read to reinforce tradition. David Bentley Hart goes on to say, "It is easy to anticipate some of the criticisms he's going to face with this translation, to see that this version of the text might elicit from those who firmly believe that anything or any rendering that should reflect the usages of latter doctrinal determinations or traditions, right? But it would be contrary to conscience on my part to try to make the words on the page conform to what latter dogmatic reflection found in them. And, after all, if orthodoxy really required that sort of discreet redaction of the record, it would be self-evidently false. My principal aim is to help awaken readers to mysteries and uncertainties and surprises in the New Testament documents, and that often lie wholly hidden from view beneath layers of received hermeneutical and theological tradition. I would hope that my translation would succeed in many places in making the familiar strange, novel, and perhaps newly compelling." David Bentley Hart has offered here a raw translation that seeks to challenge traditional spaces and ways of reading the text. And I hope he does. And for those of you that are not Christian, that are interested philosophically or hermeneutically in a variety of different directions, pick this up. Mull it over. Challenge your Christian peers. Christians, let it challenge you. Let it challenge your peers. Drink deep of the ability to be challenged. Doesn't mean you burn everything or throw the baby out. It is fine to challenge the cores of belief from within belief, not to get lost, but to continue pressing on. Thank you for your attention on this week. On a more emotional note, I'd like to salute some family friends that have lost 2 children in the last 6 months. 2 brothers have died. To Mikey and Corey, I remember you as young as middle schoolers and high schoolers, and I don't know the roads that you've traveled since then. You are beautiful people, and I remember you, and I will carry you in my heart. And to the rest of your family that is grieving you, may you be in the light.